All right. Well, this is Roger Roots of Lysander Spooner University. Here in Plains, Montana, we have a very special guest, a man with a lot of knowledge of the fire history of this region, and we got to talking about my experiences with the U.S. Forest Service fighting fires, and we had some common experiences, which seemed to point to the fact that and many times the Forest Service deliberately keeps fires going and does not actually try to put fires out. I myself, in about 2012, I actually ended up getting hired by a guy who was paying me $200 a day to wash weeds on the undercarriages of trucks as they left a fire zone at the Pine Creek Fire near Livingston, Montana. And so it was a big camp out for about 2.5 weeks for me. I literally just camped out, and maybe one truck a day came through that was leaving the fire zone there that I had to wash the weeds off the bottom of. And there were probably 100 guys on that fire, in the fire camp, and we were all doing nothing. Mountains of food were being piled on us. Old ladies would bring pies and cakes. We were all getting fat. And yet the community around us was thinking we were fighting these fires so hard. And there was a crew of about 200 firefighters that would go out on the mountain, and we could see a smoldering little puff of smoke, which was the Pine Creek Fire. In fact, the fire had blazed hard the first day. The ranchers had put most of it out. A little bit of it had lingered on the hillside in the National Forest. And the Forest Service, we could actually see them go up with helicopters and all this heavy equipment. Millions of dollars were being spent. And they were deliberately, in my opinion, keeping that fire going. In the mornings we would meet and we'd all get in a big circle, in the U.S. Forest Service district officer, probably a superintendent or a supervisor, would stand up and give a pep talk or a safety talk. And I specifically remember him one day saying to all the firefighters, guys, I know it gets pretty rough out there and pretty boring. So, if you have to, just take a paperback book and keep a paperback book in your pocket if it gets too boring, and sit down under a shade tree and try not to get too bored. Literally, I'm not kidding. And I got talking with Mr. Dan Ryan here of Plains. Dan Ryan, of course, is famous. He's the father of Jake Ryan. But beyond that, he has an immense history. He also, quite importantly, achieved 23 chin-ups at the age of 60. 23 chin-ups at the age of 60. And I'm here, and he also has a similar experience about the U.S. Forest Service spending lots of money and really deliberately not fighting or trying to dampen the fires.
I guess people have to go by their own experience, just like Roger said. And I've had more than one experience with fires here in Montana. The first one I had was up Deemer Creek, and we had some friends up there that had a home up Deemer Creek. And this fire had gotten away, and they had, I think it was started by a piece of farm equipment. And it started as a grass fire and got into the forest up there. There was like several homes, maybe 5 or 6 homes up there that were in jeopardy. And some friends of ours were up there, and they were concerned. The firefighters were just sitting there in their vehicles while this fire was threatening their home, and they were getting pretty terrified that the fire was going to reach their home. And so they called us up. It had gotten dark that night, and the firefighters won't fight after dark, and so they were just sitting in their vehicles waiting through the night. But we had a similar experience a year ago up the Sheep Gap fire, and the firefighters were so spread out last year that when the Sheep Gap fire came down into Swamp Creek area, there was maybe 15 to 20 homes in jeopardy in Swamp Creek. And one of the guys up there called us up and asked for some help because the Forest Service had told them that resources were completely exhausted, and so they just could not help these people. And so the neighborhood got together and decided they were going to try and reduce the fuels and thin the forest around their homes. Several other Forest Service workers showed up, and soon they had an organized group of Forest Service firefighters on that fire and took over the whole operation after they had said that there was no resources available. So I thought that was interesting the way that turned out. There was also a big lawsuit involved where one of the neighbors had said, given permission to cut whatever trees were necessary, and then when her husband found out about it, he was well connected with the Forest Service and firefighting, and when he found out about it, he threatened a lawsuit against anyone who was helping with that. So it kind of kept everybody quiet about their participation in the volunteer efforts. So that was another experience that clearly showed that they don't want volunteers going out and actually accomplishing what the Forest Service claims they can't do, and that is protect the homes and put out the fire.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what I've seen is that the private ranchers do. I mean, they really, they do everything to put out a fire as quickly as they can when it starts. And then if there happens to be a fire lingering on the national forest, then the government comes in, sets up a huge camp at multi-millions of dollars, and deliberately keeps the fire going. And I don't know, this could be part of the agenda of promoting hysteria and fear about forest fires, and maybe even to promote the global warming hysteria agenda. Mm-hmm. This is actually a graph of the forest fire history in the United States by acreage burned, and you can see that in the 1930s and 1940s and way back in the early 20th century, there was much more acreage burned than there is today. And yet you don't read a lot about that or see much about that in the news today. And certainly the spending of fighting fires is astronomical today, but it's nowhere near what the forest fire acreage burned from yesteryear, as it was in yesteryear.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, on that Sheep Gap fire, later on, they actually brought in some bombers and put out most of the fire, but somehow that fire managed to keep going all summer long.
Yeah, the Pine Ridge fire where I was went 5 weeks. It could have been put out in one day. Anyway, signing off. Thank you very much.